Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon we're going to do a discussion about the color-coded identities, the second in a series of events on this topic. And I'm just waiting for my guest to join. Good afternoon, Sleeping Turtle. How are you?
Doing fine. How are you? Good afternoon.
Good. Let's see here. I was debating about what to call this particular discussion. Since you're the one that suggested it, why don't you tell me what do you think it should be titled?
Well, considering that this particular topic on the black identity and how it affects a lot of us indigenous people, for some of us who are mixed, I think we could call it the effects of black identity for indigenous people. Does that work in any way?
Yes, it does. It kind of requires someone to understand a little bit about the history of colonialism and their own experiences. And so for those who might not have been made aware in their childhood or their community experience, at least it will spark some curiosity about what those effects could be. And being that we are not existing within a natural environment, meaning the indigenous one, which it's not about nature per se in the colonial sense, European sense, wildness and kind of uncivilized. We're talking about natural in the terms of the experiences of the people from the earth. So because we're not living in that environment today in the Americas and in all the places that are colonized, then we have to understand that as indigenous peoples, we are experiencing a colonial reality. It's having a colonial effect on our lives, and it is far from who we are. So matters of identity are very central to this topic, and this afternoon we're going to be talking about the Black identity. As a colonial term, what does it mean? Where did it come from? And what are some of our experiences that have informed our positions on the term today? I'm speaking from Massachusetts territory. I am Behike Hefzibah of the Taino Arawak Nation of Quisqueya, the River Haina, Aboriginal titled tribe. And I am in Massachusetts, United States, and we're here with Sleeping Turtle, who is Narragansett and Cherokee, from Aquidneck territory, what is known today as Rhode Island. All right, so as we were speaking earlier, because we are in a colonial environment, and that is one that is marked primarily by genocide, genocide of physical beings and also genocide of language, genocide of identity, known as paper genocide, where the indigenous understandings of our environment have been forcibly expunged from our histories. And so as a result, we are not only not exposed to what is real, but also being forced to what is not real. And that creates a situation where we as human beings are unaware, growing from children, from the age of children to adulthood, we are unaware of the effects of genocide simply because we're not allowed to experience the reality from the indigenous perspective. So, Sleeping Turtle, the unawareness of African cultures and the history among African Americans, how does that usually exhibit itself in this experience about the Black identity?
Well, how I personally relate to that one talking point is uh, somewhat of a humorous story as a child. One of the other children in the family had made up their face somehow in a particular way, and my grandfather, who's on my mother's side, who bears more of the African blood, he said that my sibling at that time looked like an African. And I remember thinking to myself, but grandfather, we are Africans. So, but aside from that, growing up as a mixed uh, African person here in the United States, and I have met people from the motherland known as Africa who can testify to this, is that when us African Americans are exposed to African cultures or those who are from one of the nations in Africa here in the United States, I notice that there's somewhat of a disconnect, that we don't often comprehend that for those of us who are of African descent, that those are some of our customs and cultures and part of our history. Because really, for the past century or so, we've been groomed into thinking that we're black or Negro or colored or later African American. Now, even though all those terms historically have different uses and different meanings, what I notice is that many of us who are of African descent in the United States are unaware of Africa and its various ethnicities and nationalities. For example, two of the students I had for my decolonization classes were from Nigeria. They're of the, correct me if the pronunciation is not accurate, Yoruba or Yoruba. And for them to embody that they're from their homeland in Africa to the rest of the class and the other African mixed children, it was somewhat of a shock to them that they didn't grow up thinking these colonial terms applied to them. You know, black or Negro or those other terms, they grew up believing and knowing that they're Nigerian or Yoruba or any of the other national tribes to Nigeria. And
Yes, one of my friends actually recently told me, who is actually Nigerian, I believe of Senegalese descent, um, that in Nigeria, the term black doesn't exist for a definition of a person's identity. They identify along tribal designations, very similar to the way the indigenous people have always identified here. We never said, oh, there goes, certain
yeah,
color.
well,
I know that there are some tribes that have been named by other tribes, like for a particular, perhaps, implement that they use. For example, this is a French term, but Nez Perce, for example, the pierced noses, So Indian tribes have been known for things like that. Blackfeet is another term that references color, but the primary concept is association with a tribe, not that, oh, those are people that have black feet. You know, it's not, if you see a black-footed person, you'll know, you know, it's not focused on the color. The behind that tribal name, even though it may have a color or you know, like a pierced nose, for example, it has a story behind it that inspires curiosity and also understanding between tribes, and that still exists in Africa. So when people are being called African American in the United States, or even as this so-called American, but you know, U.S. dominated way of relating to people of melanated, you know, descent from Africa, calling them Afro. It's not transferring the tribal sensitivities from Africa to these populations in the Americas. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the predominant influence of this kind of detached identity style that tries to align itself with Africa is that it puts forward the sensitivities of U.S. citizens and somewhat by extension those from Britain who are Black, and also Canadians who are Black. Whereas in the Americas, the majority of Africans that were transferred from the transatlantic slave trade were actually not in the United States. Of the approximately 10 million souls that were kidnapped from their homelands, primarily in West Africa, they were taken to colonies in Central, South America, and the Caribbean. And so today, those descendants, 9.7 million souls, live outside of the United States, whereas only around 300,000 people of African descent were brought to what is the United States. So the majority of the African descended population is actually outside of the United States and Americas. And so there is a danger from the lack of sensitivities. Outside of the United States, there are tribes of African descent who have maintained their historical records with regard to which tribes they were actually taken from in Africa, and they know those very well. I was learning the other day about an actual Congolese and Nigerian, I think it may be Yoruba, king in Bolivia that is actually an official dignitary of the plurinational Bolivian state. So he has a kingdom. He was already, the person who is the king now in Bolivia is actually a descendant of a royalty from Congo that was taken during the 1800s. And they mixed with other African kidnapped individuals, but they maintained the royal line, and they maintained the identity of the state. So they actually have official kingdom in the current state of Bolivia today. There are other African communities, African descended communities, such as the Garifuna community, which was resulting from I actually don't remember the very tribal nation in Africa, but they came from a tribal nation in Africa, and they were shipwrecked. They actually mutinied the slave ship, and they landed in what is today called St. Vincent or the Grenadines. Um, and then in the I think it's the 17 to 1800s, they were actually forcibly removed from there to Honduras, where the majority of the community is today. But they are actually a mixture of the Kalinago Carib tribal community and the African men that married the Arawakan women. And today, they call themselves Indigenous Americans because the fact that they speak a mixture of African language and Arawak. And in fact, my own tribal language, Kisken Taino, is being revived because of the preservation of the Arawakan language through the mothers, the Arawakan mothers who fathered the children of these African men who, by the way, were never slaves. So whereas in the United States, the vast majority of the African population carries a slave narrative, whether it's forced or not, because there, of course, there were always free Black or African people in the United States as well, in the Americas, North America. But of course, they were the vast minority. The majority of the African population in North America were enslaved. However, the Garifuna were never enslaved, and so the narratives of being African and enslaved, those topics actually don't apply to Garifuna. They were always free people, and so I also wanted to mention another thing, where there are recent African immigrants that have come after all of these hundreds of years to the Americas as immigrants, doctors and scientists and historians, a lot of very highly qualified people from Africa. And they come and identify as African American, but they don't share the history of repression, racial repression. Oh, yes. Just got a question from Isa El Mahdi. Mali. I actually I don't know, Isa. But if you can quickly Google that for us, that would be great. Yes. So just keep watching and contributing. Thank you for your question. The recent African immigrants, they come and identify as African American, not having any of the background and understanding the repression that has gone on and how the Black identity was developed in the United States in particular. There are other countries of the world where Black, Afrikaans, and other terminologies that was based on color also have its own regional denotations and connotations. For example, we have people in Samoa that have been called Black. For hundreds of years they were repressed because they were not white Europeans. And then today, when they present themselves as having a shared experience in the repressed Black reality of colonialism, they're rejected and say, oh no, you're not Black because you're not American Black. The Black people of South Africa, for example, they are natives, but they were called all kinds of names and to reject them from the society. And they have also their own narratives that come with that. So in the United States, North America, paper genocide affected a lot of indigenous people that did not even have any African identity whatsoever, I mean, descendancy whatsoever. And we were just called black off of the bat because of the papal bulls, which were mandated from the Vatican, a military scientific organization in Europe, to enslave and genocide indigenous populations, the excuse being that we were darker colored and therefore somehow related to the Moors that the Europeans had just kicked out in 1491 during the Spanish Inquisition, when the Moors were kicked from Europe after 800 years of. So we were facing a reprisal against the Moors that we were not even. We didn't share their identity. So that's how. Those are just some things where people in the United States are unaware about African cultures that are shared inside the Americas and also outside of the Americas and in Africa themselves. So let's go on to the next point. It takes quite a lot to break down all of these points. And usually we don't, I don't use notes, but this is just so complex and just have to.
Wait till we do the white episode.
What's that? Yeah, we will.
Yeah,
we absolutely
if you think
will.
this is complex, wait till that one.
Yeah, exactly. So misunderstanding colonial slave terminology. What can you tell us about that, Sleeping Joe?
Well, one thing I notice about, just to narrow a few of those terms down, obviously there's a lot of unrealistic ones, but where I'm going with this is that really I noticed back in the civil rights movement, my grandfather's generation in particular, is that when a lot of those movements and demonstrations were beginning here in the United States, specifically people of African descent were trying to redefine socially and legally what the terms black, Negro, and colored meant in American law. Now, this is something that I brought up at my last class with a different group of students where there was some division among them because they weren't fully understanding the complexity of it. Now, to make this easy, the term black, as I explained to them, is an English word. English comes from England, the UK, Europe, so it's a European word, right? And when you look up black in a dictionary, even on Google, you'll see that it's synonymous with wickedness or negativity or evil or misdeeds or any of those synonymous negative terms. So for me, growing up and developing my vocabulary, seeing that the term black in the English language was related to all these other negative terms, and then it starts to dwell on me that, but I'm a black person, so am I evil or wicked or anything like that? And once you look into the linguistics of it, you see why the European colonizers are using certain words for specific groups of people because they carry power. It's like they're casting verbal spells. Now,
Right.
I did some digging into the etymology of the word black, and prior to the Spanish Inquisition, black meant pale or colorless, albino, or lacking color. So you can argue that before the Inquisition happened, a quote black person was a European with a fair complexion. Now obviously that is debatable, and we won't get into that today. Or Negro in Spanish, because that word comes from the Latin word negrum, which meant black, but was still used as a negative term to describe other forms of negativity. So I noticed with African Americans for the past century, it's like they're getting a few things backwards, where they think that the word is universal in all languages, so they're overlooking the linguistic complexities of these very basic words. So, and what I try to encourage
Mhm.
my students to do is to, look into this stuff because of its linguistic and legal ramifications, um, but it's really simple to see that, with the exception of a few, most human beings are not dark enough to be literally called black. As dark as the nighttime sky, or as this tool case right here. The same thing goes for Europeans who are classified as
Mhm.
white. They're not pale enough to blend in with the winter snow and all that stuff. But then that's where you get into connotative and denotative linguistics. So it's complex on purpose because all of that is a colonial invention to oppress and divide people. But when you use the knowledge against the colonizers, one, it puts them in a spot to admit that they've committed fraud on various levels. But that's how you start to decolonize language,
Mhm.
because English is the colonial language. It's not
Mhm.
from the Americas, not even close.
Right. Um, so the early so-called African Americans, um, they were attempting to empower their community by creating, being as inclusive as possible, remaining within the paradigm of uh, that was afforded to them at the time of colonial law. So people like Frederick Douglass, for example, um, they they had some views that actually were controversial, would be controversial today regarding the Black identity, but those were formed by them attempting to gain the good graces of abolitionists that were themselves already within a very narrow mind frame of what was allowed. Um, to acknowledge the existence and the humanness of their fellow human being. So people like the Quakers, for example, um, other abolitionists, they had that still idea that European language and law and propriety and all of those things were to be the permanent identity of this part of the world. Um, but they felt that they would be more powerful. Their organization of the Quaker religion, for example, would be more powerful if they incorporated individuals like Frederick Douglass, for example. And so a lot of these freedom movements that are in the United States historically are actually part of the genocide. They weren't really ever meant to make people free. They were trying to simply expand power of the colonial idea. So in order to create black colonialism, really, basically, that's what it means.
Yeah,
So people
black
today
capitalism too.
who are yeah, yes, exactly, capitalist, just European ideas in general. They're meant to spin off from the papal bulls of 1452 and 1455 and 1493, also known as the Doctrine of Discovery, which is supposed to give European languages the right to make definitions, even if they come across something that doesn't even exist in Europe, like the animals and just concepts that just naturally in human civilization you would normally use the language or the understanding of the local people, but the Vatican said no. We are already banning science for our own European people, so why don't we just ban Indigenous understanding everywhere? And so that's why we have today a lot of people who have endangered themselves through the colonial identities, even while they think that they are freeing themselves or empowering themselves through something that would be like African American or Black. So I actually wanted to read from a recent publication of the Garifuna. They published this recently, and I felt it was a very powerful article because it actually speaks about the struggle that they had with this identity. It says that in the 16th century, the European enslavers called the Garifuna Black Caribs, and fugitive slaves. So even though the Garifuna had never been slaves, the Europeans demanded that they be called slaves because of the people. People have to understand the reason why they were doing that. It wasn't just because they were throwing epithets per se, but that there were patents, permissions that were being granted to the European individuals that would be operating in the native territories from the Vatican, saying, as long as you are encountering certain melanated people, you must refer to them as slaves in order to get in order to transact the loan that you just got. So that's what they had to do. That was a mandatory thing. It wasn't because they just didn't like them, although obviously there was a lot of rancor and resentment and obviously inhumane behavior that accompanied that. So it says here, the Garifuna say that in other accounts, okay, the same people that were being referred to as Black Caribs, and fugitive slaves were also being called the natives of the island of St. Vincent. And notice that St. Vincent itself is a European name, and that's not the name of the island itself, the native name. Let's see, I'm just going to look up here, a native name, island of St. Vincent. Okay, Hairona. So that's the actual indigenous name of the island. But they were saying that the Garinago are the natives of St. Vincent. So they didn't want to say Hairona, they want to put the European name. It says here, consequently, after the Garinago arrived in Roatan, as a result of exile, the stories written by scholars and mestizo politicians, in other words, people that were mixed, that's what mestizo means, called the Garinago as morenos, negritos. Moreno means dark skin. Negrito means blackish. It's a diminutive word in Spanish, so it's like the little blacks. Negros means black, and trigueños means three, mixed with three, so indigenous, Black, and European. That became popular in the collective imagination of the population, being the discourse of the communicator, academic and religious. So that means the people that were in charge of reporting conditions of any kind, whether it be a governor or a merchant, as well as the what do you call this, so-called civil society, which is the academics, those university individuals, and the religious clerics. They were all agreeing together to be colonizers and to be genocidals. It would not surprise you, it says, to read in the daily Honduran press in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, quote, a black man is run over, unquote. Quote, a black woman dies on the way to the hospital, unquote. However, in the 1980s, the OFRANEH led the campaign Uwara Wayabi Lida Badua Aba. So that is the Garifuna, from the Garifuna language. And this initiative emitted a strong message of Garifuna belonging and forced the society to decline to call them negritos, morenos, and trigueños, but Garinago and Garifuna. In the same period of the 1980s and 1990s, a group of talented young people were reborn and took on the commitment to continue with the initiative of relevance among them. The late Salvador Suazo, who founded Garawon Garifuna, a radio program of the importance of the culture of the Garifuna people. Likewise, Julio Morales founded Garinago Waigia with students of the UPNFM, and Crisanto Melendez did promotional work challenging the racist society of that time to shout the name Garifuna in the main squares of Tegucigalpa, that is the capital of Honduras. At the Regional Conference of the Americas held in Santiago, Chile in 2000, the term Afro-descendant was adopted to designate all people of African descent in the Americas in preparation for the World Summit Against Racism and Xenophobia in Durban, South Africa in 2001. Many Garifuna leaders of the diaspora attended this event. Upon their return, some motivated by the economic offer of international organizations, began a campaign threatening the Garifuna identity and insisting that only the term Afro-descendant and not Garifuna be used, at the same time suggesting the term Afro-Honduran. So this is showing that major organizations around the world are actually participating in paper genocide and forcing people to adopt false African identities. And that applies to people who are of African descent, including the Garifuna. So what that means is erasing the history of those African descended peoples behind a false Afro word, a word that is supposed to mean a name, whereas in the continent of Africa, that's not even an African. That's not even an African term. That's Africanus. That's something that comes from Europe. People in Africa do not identify as African. They identify as their nation. But nevertheless, again, because of the papal bulls and the organizations that are involved, there's a lot of money, civil society, they promote the idea that by using the term Afro, they are empowering the melanated and marginalized colonial populations. So we continue just very briefly. It says both concepts generated debate and confusion in the Garifuna society, especially those who lived in the main cities. However, in the communities far from the discourse of the Garifuna elite, Garinago and Garifuna always remained as their only cultural identity. So in remaining true to their African ancestors, they were insisting on maintaining a tribal identity, which is so different than just a blanket colonial term that is supposed to be sympathetic to African. As you can see, there have always been attempts to change the sense of relevance of the Garifuna people, but they cannot because of the spiritual strength that characterizes them, which also symbolizes resistance and freedom. The Garifuna language is our weapon of struggle and its breath for generations, and its name will be eternal. That was written to Andoni Perez, a Garifuna writer, from my understanding. So that's just an example from the Garifuna community regarding what you mentioned. I just felt that it was so important to include their account. We were not able to include, to have any guests, Garifuna guests, but if there's anyone from the Garifuna community that would like to expound on this understanding, that would be wonderful. All right, so the next point, misunderstanding beliefs for ethnographic identity. Well, let us back up just 1 second, because the last time we talked about this, um, we did mention that the the term for melanated people as being black, just generally, the word black or negro was actually first applied to my people, the Caribbean Arawakan. So we are the ones who actually had the first experience being called black. The Garifuna are in the Caribbean, so um, and they are Arawakan, just like I am. So um, the people that are in North America, trying to own what is black, it's not proper, because um, you here were all called that because of how my nation was being called. How do you say that? Misappropriated? Was that misappropriation, or was that misnamed? Misnamed. Yeah. So my people were misnamed. We understood. Misnamed. Yeah. So my people were being um, uh, oppressed to adopt the black, to be called black. And so going back, uh, uh, I'll say geographically speaking, when people from the United States go to Dominican Republic, for example, or other nations of the Caribbean, and people are saying, yeah, I'm dark skinned, but I don't want to be called black. It's not about racism. It's simply because, like the Garifuna, who are very, very dark skinned, we as tribal, indigenous, uh, Caribbean, Arawakan people, we do not want to have colonial terms associated with us. And that means we reject even the quote unquote benefits that might come from those colonial identities that are supposed to be afforded to us by colonial law. And because we have rejected those racial terms, including Afro, being called Afro for a long time, just like the Garifuna, we have been called racist. Oh, you're ashamed of being black. Um, but it's not we are ashamed. We simply reject it. As tribal peoples, we reject these colonial terms. However, at the same time, when people want to understand the foundation, the purpose, the history of the term black, they should always go to Arawakan people, Taino people, because we are the ones that had the first encounter with the intent of that term. And yes, we can actually guide you to those to background. So I just wanted to mention that you brought up the misunderstanding beliefs for ethnographic identity. Have we ever already covered that, or well, okay, so the since we're both here as informed individuals, um, how did you, because you grew up, you said, as African American, correct? You grew up as African American. How did you come upon the knowledge of indigenous ethnographic principles for your own nation? So how did you come to that understanding that your tribal identity existed, was important, and it superseded colonial ethnic terms, or was supposed to be ethnic? So black is not really an ethnicity, but most people think of it as in the United States. So how were you able to differentiate and come away from that?
Well, luckily I wrote my answer down for that specific point. Now, uh, for those of you who are watching and you're not familiar with the term ethnographic and ethnography is the study of ethnicities. It's more of a sociological term within academia. So let's move on. Well, how I regained my understanding, the indigenous understanding of ethnicity, is that really through experiencing different indigenous customs, ceremonies, and crafts. In fact, I was at a Nahagangsa event earlier this morning. Now, when you experience different aspects of your heritage, knowing the history behind those specific things is important because it helps you absorb that identity and to reject the colonial terminology and the linguistics of it within law. Now, specifically, while Indigenous American, which I do answer to, is a general term, the tribal and national names are specific identities. The specific identities and individual cultures would classify all tribal nations as ethnicities. Many of the tribal nations share common languages, ancestry, etc. But one thing to keep in mind is that ethnicity has multiple meanings within academia. So it's not a one size fits all phrase or term. After much erasure and paper genocide as a mixed Afro-Indigenous American, which I have no problem answering to, it takes time to absorb the complexity of colonization in order to decolonize myself. For my heritage, again, going back to indigenous linguistics, the Aniunia, who are now the Cherokee and the Nahagangsit, aka the Narragansett, both of them are tribal and national ethnicities. Now, because of the Atlantic slave trade, both of them do have a good amount of African blood, whereas in the state of Rhode Island, the Nahagangsit historically, legally identified as black, Negro, or colored, which contributed to the paper genocide. Now, changing the legal identity was done for safety because we were still being targeted by different agencies of the United States because of us being indigenous to the land. Um, Now, misunderstanding social beliefs
These were often.
like the black eye, huh?
Yeah, no, I just remind people that when we're talking about dangers of behind identity, we're talking about capital punishment with death.
Yes.
People were indigenous people. They would be threatened not to be within certain territory, or else they would be subject to manhunters, regardless of their age or gender. They were targeted. So by Nahagantsit, for example, like you just mentioned, Sleepy Turtle, saying that they're black. If they were stopped somewhere, who are you? What are you? Oh, I'm black. Okay, you can go. You see, that was a life or death decision. It wasn't something that came from being in a popular club or enjoying civil liberties per se, like drinking from a particular fountain. These were life and death matters.
Hmm.
So I just wanted to clarify that.
But yes, going back to what you said earlier, because, again, one thing we all have to remember is all of this originates in the Caribbean. I'm grateful for you to keep reminding me because it takes time. Now, uh, one of the things you said where one thing I guess both of us have noticed is that uh, the Afro-descended people in the United States feel they have to protect the black identity, and there's some confusion over what they think it means versus what it means in law and all the other different classifications. Like, for example, an Australian Aborigine could visit Providence, Rhode Island, and uh, the Africans there would just think that he's one of them. No, he's Australian, Aboriginal Australian, but because of the dark melanation, they would just assume that he's from Africa or he lives in the neighborhood somewhere. So a lot of that is the problem with not being well educated or aware of different cultures or groups of people outside of the United States. It's a lot of willful ignorance is what I notice with certain people, but um, like one example that happened in South Africa during apartheid was there was a lawyer who was talking to a judge during an important case. Now, one of the lawyer's phrases, who was of South African descent, he was famous for saying, "Black is beautiful." Now, in court, they asked him, well, black, usually has a negative meaning in English, the black market, black list, black plague, and all of that. The judge asked him, so why do you call yourselves black?
Black.
You people are more, because you people are more brown than black. And the lawyer said to him, well, why do you call yourselves white? You are more pink than white. And the judge goes, precisely. But there was no deeper conversation about that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to answer one of the questions that were presented earlier, as far as the descendants, the African descendancy, the tribes of the Garifuna ancestors. And it says here, reading from Wikipedia, so it's subjective, of course. However, the majority of the shipwrecked passengers were from Angola, Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Congo, and Ghana. And of course, these names of the countries, they were not the names of the tribes. They're in those countries that were partitioned by the Europeans and given those names. They sound African, Congo, Angola, but in reality, this is what it's really saying is tribes within the European partition territories of. So that's why I didn't want to just answer right away, yes, Mali, yes, because to be most accurate in the African sense, it would be to name the actual tribal people who they were from. But generally speaking, the people from the shipwreck and the 1600s who are now Indigenous Americans because of the marriage to Arawakan women, they were from West Africa. So that's just to answer the question that was posed earlier. Okay, so let's see. The next one, origin of the words black and Negro. Okay, so we mentioned this before about the linguistic import or the linguistic effect of colonial terms for identity, ethnicity, such as black and Negro. But we haven't really gotten into the differentiations because there's kind of two branches. One of them is denotation and one of them is connotation. So when a person talks about ethnicity using the term black, that could mean a whole lot of things. And can you tell us, Sleeping Turtle, how do we know that there's a denotative or connotative element going on, and where should we be looking for that?
Well, to put it in context, because I teach this to all my students so that when they're reading literature, they can tell that either that the author or the source is lying or there's a distorted meaning in there. Now, for example, I just did this, and it's very easy to find this on your search engine, but for those of you who don't know, a connotation is figurative, it's not literal. A denotation is literal, and often the it is often the factual resource or definition. Now, I'm going to do this on camera.
Can you give
I went on to Google and typed it.
Can you give us an
What?
example? Okay, no, I was gonna say, can you also give us an example? So, for example, I'm just gonna say the fact is, I am a person of African descent. How would I be denotated as Black? What is the difference between connotated as Black or denotated as Black?
Well, to put it simply in English, the denotation of Black is this. It's this shade. If your skin is not this shade exactly, denotatively, you are not Black. Connotatively, this would be Black to most American people, but to a first grade art student, this is brown, or there's some red hue in there. But again, that's connotative. It's not literal. But that's part of the problem with colonial linguistics, in order to oppress different people, is that they don't teach the difference of connotative and denotative. We think that there's only multiple meanings and they're all synonymous with each other. There's some truth in that, but to a scholar, they know that that's fraud because of colonialism. So, I actually wrote about this in my book the other day, but I'm not going to waste time grabbing it. But I have a sword, like for my own personal study. There's a holster on it where in Europe that holster is called a frog. Now it's made of leather and has snaps and buttons on it. So connotatively, it's a frog to mount your sword on your belt. Whereas they know denotatively a frog is an amphibious reptile, like out near a water source. So, something really
Frog?
minute as that. Yeah. Because the thing with connotative linguistics is that all slang is connotative. It's not literal.
Yeah, as a child and as an adult, I have faced so much pain because, and it's trauma. It's terrible. Because I grew up in areas that would be called a Black community or a Black neighborhood. As a child, I spent time in both Black and white neighborhoods, and I went to both white and Black schools. And because my family, my father was very dark skinned, and my grandfather very, very, very dark. My grandmother kind of more like your color and more having a reddish hue. But just to be clear, my father was, from a distance he would be called Black, but I mean, like really, he had black hair, he had quote unquote black, connotatively black skin, but very dark Black. So close up, and I'm just, being more intimate with this. Close up, I could see as a child the difference between my father's skin and an American, so-called American Black, because Carib people, we have a very specific hue. There's kind of a cinnamon hue, and that's because the Arawakan people, like many Eastern Coast Indians and some Southern, like the Apache, we have dark Black, quote unquote Black cinnamon skin. naturally. This is before Africans were brought to this part of the world. There are tribes that are, you know, Nordic, like toward Alaska, the let's see, Inupiaq people, I believe that's the correct word. They live very close to Russia and to China, and they had even the Silk Road was exchanging Venetian beads 50 years before the arrival of Columbus to the Americas in 1492. And that's been documented. So obviously, with exchange of trade, they were mixing with lighter skinned people of the Asian continent. So that's different from people on the East Coast. Like my tribal people, we were always already very dark cinnamon skinned people. So as a child, I could see the difference between my father and the American black, so-called African Americans, who are primarily mixed white and African. You know, there are many who are mixed with indigenous, of course, but there's just a different hue there. Also, there are black English, black British, you know, people who came to the Americas as black people from Europe, from the Moorish times and before. There were always black people in Europe. Yep. So those people, those admixtures, I could see the difference. I could see it. My father's features also, his nose, and I went back to my tribal lands in Quisqueya. My grandfather's relatives, they all have this very similar features. You know, the nose is different than many Africans in the United States. So there were a lot of phenotypical differences that I could tell, you know, between my father and my father's family and the African American experience. But when we were interacted with in the American society that is predominated by white proclivities and sensitivities and those things, we were treated as black. And we lived, when you were in the black neighborhood, in other words, if a white person would come to visit us, like a housing inspector, or you know, the meter man, you know, a postal person, whoever it was, that was white, the Mormons, right? The white Mormons, they would actually travel on missions from Utah and from their little colonizer white concentration camp, and hand out these booklets saying, you know, color the dark-skinned Indians, the sinners, black, and the good Indians, you color them white. So they would be preaching to us as if we were a black, sinful family, and so that's what I grew up with. So it was, you know, these are assaults as a human being. These are assaults to the person. But I have to mention that even as I was being assaulted as a black, I was also being rejected by black people. So when I went to school, because I didn't speak like them, and I had an indigenous identity, a lot of people so they I don't know, have you frozen? Yeah. So the so-called Indigenous Americans here in the community in Northeast, and you know, like some people from the Taino community, they've even said to me, "Oh, you are just learning about your Taino heritage just now from the internet or whatever," and you know, as landed tribal people that my family is, and just like many Garifuna people who we have always identified along tribal lines. So unlike many displaced Taino people who have like second generation, third generation experiences as American blacks or as American Latinos, I did not go to school declaring myself as a black person, whereas my schoolmates, they could, because that's how they grew up. For many generations, you're talking about like more than 400 years, that they were identify as Black, even though many of them were mixed with Indigenous. So because my family, my identity came from the Caribbean, I was Arawakan, number one. My father never said to me, "You're Black." This is, I did not grow up with that. This just didn't exist in my family. And my mother, being a white European woman, um, you know, we discussed the history of her family as colonizers from very early age, but I was never identifying as white either. That was like way out of the picture. So there was no white, there was no Black. I was an Arawakan woman of North African, North and West African descent, you know. And of course, we talked about the history in my family. We talked about the histories of the Moors and the different tribes in North Africa, and the biblical history behind them, and so on and so forth. So that's where we have, even as Caribbean Arawakan people, we have Jewish relationships based on the history from Africa. That's just the fact. And again, this is another thing where I have been mocked in the Taino community by some very illiterate and very degenerate individuals, who are just violent European gangster mentality colonizers that go around acting as if they're Taino. They have been mocking, saying, "Oh, you crazy, think you're Jewish and this and the other. Your parents were like Black Hebrews," like all this nonsense. Whereas in the defense of our tribal lands, there have constantly been relationships of the biblical history with the indigenous one. And one of the most famous stories is that of Liborio, who was an indigenous person from San Juan de la Maguana in Quisqueya. And he was killed during the time of the US invasion of the island in 1960s. And he was defending the tribal territories from Europeans, actually Italians, the Italian colonizers that were trying to partition and sell off our tribal lands there. So he went around talking about indigenous resistance in the terms of the John the Baptist. See, so this is, again, these are tribal designations. These are not based off of color. So just giving you like kind of like a lot of intimate details and historical examples. When I went to school, this is how I presented, right? I'm like an alien. Among Black people, I'm an alien. I also, when I went to the white schools, I was bullied and picked on by the white teachers. And in one particular school, all of the students in my class were white, except for one very, 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 very dark, actually Black girl. And she must have been, being that it was like near the Virginian countryside, she must have been a descendant of one of the African slaves, that remained in the area. So because she was so Black, she was like African, and they left her alone. They kind of ignored her. It was almost like she didn't exist. She was like the invisible, just the same way like in the slave homes, she was the invisible person. However, for me, being only 6 years old at the time, the teacher was telling the kids to beat me, pull my hair, slap me around. It was because they knew that I was indigenous. I was not Black or white. I was not somebody that they could ignore because I had a land claim, you see? So I just wanted to mention that there are so many indigenous people who have experienced that, although connotatively we can identify as Black because many of us have it African. Denotatively, it's clashed. There have been examples where in our lives we're not allowed to enjoy even the invisibility of Black people. You understand? So we're not allowed to pass as Black. And in the Black school, I just have to say, I faced many beatings and discrimination as well from the Black so-called African. Probably a lot of those teachers were mixed with Indigenous, but because they were so steeped in the African identity and the Blackness, then they viewed someone like myself who could not identify along those colonial lines as a threat. So I just wanted to add that. Let's talk about the subcultural meanings. Now that we're onto the connotation, the subcultural meanings and how they do not erase genocidal purposes.
Well, before we get to that, I have to provide examples to help demystify that the Black term, because much of it is misunderstood in the United States. Now, where I was going earlier with that, one thing about linguistics, particularly among scholars, there's a rule academically that you must put the word in its proper matrix, meaning it's part of speech before you define it. Now, anybody can do this. I went to Google and typed in Black definition. Now, in italics, it's listed as an adjective, meaning it's an enhancing word, a descriptor. In English linguistics, an adjective cannot be a noun. Therefore, Black is not a person, place, thing, or idea. These are their rules, mind you, the colonizer rules. Definition 1, after the adjective, of the very darkest color owing to the absence or of complete absorption of light, the opposite of white. Now, related words, black, dark, negative, pitch black, jet black, inky, deathly, deadly. There's quite a few here. Now, if you look further down in the entry, there's one here. There's a connotation listed as entry 2. Of any human group having dark-colored skin, especially of African or Australian Aboriginal ancestry. Now, the one underneath that, of relating to Black people, quote, Black culture, but those are listed as connotations. If you understand the difference of the first entry, that it's an adjective, like there's no such thing as Black culture or Black people or Blackness. Like it's right now, to add on to the whole part of speech thing.
Mm-hmm. So no, you're saying that the intent behind calling people Black is to rob us of humanity.
Yes. Now, for example, the next word I put in, and you can find this in a dictionary, the term blackamoor, now, which goes back to the Spanish Inquisition. Now, blackamoor, which is, you know, which is a confusing term because blackamoor occupies 3 different parts of speech. Black is the adjective, awe is the preposition, the connector, and more is the noun. So what is the identity of these people who think they're Black or Negro? Now, that's an old word. It's not often used anymore, but just as an example. And I'm looking at some of the artwork here done by Europeans, and they paint these people to look as dark as that tool case I showed you. So it just shows that
is it a
when they create these... Huh?
Is that a caricature? The Black is the blackamoor, is that a caricature?
What do you mean by caricature? I don't often use that word.
Excuse me.
Excuse you.
It's a pool around here. Oh,
Excuse you.
Woof. Thank you. Blackamoor caricature. That would be you know, like the Pickaninny or those kind of racial cartoon depictions.
Stereotypes?
No, it's kind of like they're kind of like what do you call it? Like they're cartoons. They're cartoons that were drawn. Yeah, they're like cartoon characters or figures that were drawn on a lot of the colonizer commercial things like soaps and just you know you know, the newspapers or whatever, you know, mocking in black people or melanated people, and so they would have uh, certain drawings that were very typical.
Yes.
They copied a similar style, so they would sometimes it would pickaninnies, or they would call them, like if it was a black baby, they would call it like a pickaninny, or is that what the blackamoor is, or is it actually like a designation, like a name to call people?
Well, it is a caricature because one, blackamoor, with the way it's written, it's technically English. And that's the thing, because when you trace that word back to the Inquisition and Columbus and whatnot, that term was created to start the process to dehumanize, one, their Moorish occupiers of that time. And I'm looking at some of the old
Mm.
ceramics here, and they look rather like offensive, like they're like overly cartoonish, they're exaggerated, they, you know, much like propaganda, really. Now,
Yeah,
and
propaganda.
going
That's the
on,
word I was looking for.
yeah. Now,
Tanya.
to go further with,
I wish you were part of.
and to go,
No, go ahead, Sleeping Turtle. I'm just
now,
saying
to
hi to
go,
the participants in the room.
all right. Now, I have one of the etymology entries for black here. Luckily, I saved it. For those of you who don't know, etymology is the study of words. All right, moving on. And it says here, and I quote, the word black can be traced back to its Proto-Indo-European origins through the word block, which meant pale, colorless, or albino. In Old English, black person meant someone fair, devoid of color, similar to the word blanc, which means white or fair person. Now, the word black, when you put the timeline on it in a dictionary, it doesn't go past the year 1100 CE, so it's not an ancient word. If anything, it's Old or Middle English or Old High German, which a lot of English words are of Germanic origin. So there's more here, which
That's
I'm
interesting.
trying to go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted it just to interject, because you're talking about the devoid. I think that the point they were getting out here is that the use of the term black to apply to human beings was intended to give an idea of a person being non-existent. And in the Doctrine of
Yes.
Discovery, the Papal Bull of May 1493, it designated indigenous people as Homo animalis, or animals,
Mm-hmm.
human animals. So by calling a
Yes.
person black, they were be able, basically, there was a formed by saying these are not actual humans, they're animals. And that's why in the white school that I attended, that black girl was treated as if she was non-existent. Because in that language, they do not acknowledge the existence of black, whatever is black. Black means the non-existent person.
Well, yes, the next piece of legislation here is from the state of South Carolina. I'm glad that I found it. You know, sometimes the internet is amazing. So it's titled The Negro Law of South Carolina, Chapter 1, The Status of the Negro, His Rights and Disabilities. And for the record, indigenous people are classified under the same legislation as I'll read. Pardon me, slurring a bit.
What year?
Section 1,
Can you give us the year?
1740.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, Section 1, the Act of 1740. Section 1 declares all Negroes and Indians, free Indians, and enmity and with this government, Negroes, mulattoes, and mestizos who are now free, accepted to be slaves, the offspring to the fellow condition of the mother, and that such slaves are chattels personal. Section 2, under the provision, it has been uniformly held that color is prima facie evidence that the party bearing the color of a Negro, mulatto, or mestizo is a slave, but the same prima facie result does not follow from the Indian color. Wait, hold on, I lost it. I'm going back. Bear with me.
And that has to do with the papal bull of 1452 and 1455. That is what that is actually referring to, because there it says if the person is black, they are automatically a slave.
Yeah.
And this is now, they're saying that a person being Indian is not necessarily a slave. That's the prima facie what they're saying. Nevertheless, the majority of slaves in the United States were indigenous. That's what a lot of people are not understanding. All the way to California, Mexico, and so on, the majority of slaves were they weren't black, they weren't African, they were actually indigenous.
Yeah.
I just wanted
now,
to,
Section 3.
Teresa wants to join the. We're almost done with our points, and then I would be glad to add people to the video. That would make it actually more interesting. So yes, go ahead, Sleeping Turtle, and we'll try to get back to you, Teresa, as soon as we're finished with these points for feedback.
Okay. All right, Section 3. Indians and descendants of Indians are regarded as free Indians in enmity with this government until the contrary be shown. In the second proviso of Section 1 of the Act of 1740, it is declared that, quote, every Negro, Indian, mulatto, and mestizo is a slave unless the contrary can be made to appear. Yet in the same, it is immediately thereafter provided that, quote, the Indians in enmity with this government accepted, in which case the burden of proof shall lie upon the defendant, that is on the person claiming the Indian plaintiff to be a slave. This latter clause of the proviso is now regarded as furnishing the rule. The slave Indians or of Indians is not in enmity to this government, in parentheses, the state is extinct, and hence the previous part of the proviso has no application. Section 4, the term Negro is defined to slave Africans in parentheses, the ancient Berbers and their descendants. It does not embrace the free inhabitants of Africa, such as the Egyptians, Moors, or the Negro Asiatics, such as the Lazars. Section 5, mulatto is the issue of the white and the Negro. Section 6, when the mulatto
No, I was
ceases
just
and the
gonna say
party bearing.
yeah, there's a delay in the
When the
video, so
mulatto.
we're not hearing each other at the exact
Yeah.
time.
Mhm. When the mulatto ceases and a party bearing some slight taint of the African blood ranks as white is a question for the solution of a jury. And this is under South Carolina law, and luckily it was preserved in order for me to read it to you. Yeah, the Negro law of South Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as we're getting into this topic, I would like to bring to remembrance the indigenous way of identifying that we had more than one way uh, to associate with our nations. So this is separate a separate area of conversation besides simple tribal clan or nation or confederacy, um, you know, designations that are within the tribe. So just as today there are people of indigenous descent from multiple tribes, our tribal nations were always mixing, intermarrying before colonial times. And new nations were born, new confederacies were born, and allegiances as well. And as a result, new identities and ways of identifying were also created as part of the human civilization. So there are a few identity protocols within indigenous tribes, and the first are defined by that person's tribal heritage, that is their family identity, and how their tribal nation actually passes on the identity. Some tribes are patrilineal. That means that the identity is passed to the father. Some tribes are matrilineal, meaning that the identity is passed to the mother. Some tribes are both sides, you know, and they can change based on whatever the conditions are in the tribal nation or confederacy. And actually, a tribal elder from the Iroquois, the Mohawk, was telling me recently that when he was teaching in university, he asked some of the academics what they understood that was the role of the women in the tribe, or well, actually, who in the tribe, which gender in the tribe was responsible for planting. And some of the academics at one point in time, let's say 1 decade, they were all writing academic papers saying that it was the women's responsibility. And then some time passed, and then all of the academics that had gone to that same community then said that it was the men's responsibility. And the Mohawk elder was explaining to me that both of them were actually correct. And the reason is because the Mohawk tribe, they have responsibilities are changing on a yearly basis. They have a game where the men competed, against women for different roles. So in a similar way, when it comes to ethnicity, or national identity, it all has to do with a specific chronology and responsibility of that tribal nation at that period of time, and so one would have to actually be connected with their tribal history in order to understand what their designation should be, whether it's patrilineal or matrilineal, which of course is different from patriarchal or matriarchal, because those are also predominantly European defined identities of what is proper in the roles of leadership in the community. So when we're talking about identity, the patrilineal, matrilineal, that will be important. For example, if a person has an African mother and an indigenous father, how do they identify only as indigenous? Like the Garifuna, for example, they don't identify as African; they identify as Arawakan people. So the second is Indigenous Agreements. So a lot of people don't know this, but there is a separate category of Indigenous identity that is very inclusive, and that has to do with the intertribal, international relationships and responsibilities that the tribes share. And this takes into account tribes that come from other continents, like the Asians that came across the ice bridge, in the trade with the North Americans, the Pacific Islanders that would come by sea. This is all pre-colonial history, and also the Europeans that came, the Viking, which they themselves are a mixture of European tribes. Viking is not actually an ethnicity, but those people called Vikings, how they related once they were in indigenous communities, and some of them actually married and returned to Europe with their indigenous indigenous American wives, and also children were born to Vikings in the Americas as well while they were here briefly in the 1000s. So when those people, the product of those unions, when they were engaging in their responsibilities, it was on a tribal nation basis, even though they came from regions or territories that were outside of the Americas. The identity, the way that people relate as indigenous, our indigenous people here, we relate on the tribal basis. That's usually how it works. Because of we're looking at, even a colonizer is belonging to a specific tribe, even if they just want to call themselves white, we do see past that. We say, well, you're not actually white, you're, from whatever it is, the tribe that you are, and you engage in an agreement with the indigenous nation. And so as a result, your resulting identity is one of the agreement, being that you're here. Or even if you are back home, if you happen to return here, you will be known as a person of such and such agreement. So again, the Arawakan elder was telling me that the Pennsylvania Dutch, who are not indigenous by any stretch of the imagination, they are considered Iroquois by the Iroquois Confederacy. And that means the people of the covenant. So the covenant is the Gushwenta, and so since the Dutch, they actually entered into agreement with the Turo Wampum, known as the Gushwenta, then once they did that, they became the people of that agreement. So the Pennsylvania Dutch, even though they're European tribal, they are also Iroquois. So that's just another interesting point. And then there are these colonial terms that we are dealing with that have to do with the way that our tribal names have been changed or modified. Like you know, like we were mentioning earlier, the Nez Perce, or even Blackfeet, for example. Like in the tribal languages, the words, the names have very, very specific meanings and relate to a history. But as indigenous peoples in the American colonized context, we're often made to identify as indigenous, but with a colonial imposition, if that's clear. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that as we're talking about these things, as far as the proper way to identify. Um, and we kind of agreed before the conversation not to say to people how they should identify, being melanated and being of a disadvantaged or marginalized community. And I think that's where we kind of left off about the subcultural meaning. So, in other words, just because a person identifies with a movement such as Black Lives Matter, the use of the colonial term to coalesce the community, to make people feel like they're part of a group, that they're, you know, there's some cohesion of identity, some shared experiences, that it actually does not empower the individual to throw off the veil of intergenerational trauma and genocide. That is actually the reason why they have to call themselves Black. So the reason why the Garifuna, Arawakan people, and my people also, we do not call ourselves Black, and we don't call ourselves Black, is because we reject even the benefits that the colonial assigned to us under that term. And the reason is because those benefits are meant to bypass the genocidal history. They're meant to avoid the references inside the papal bulls by which the colonizer claims to take our land and to make us invisible and non-existent or animals per their legislation, as it was referenced by the U.S. Supreme Court twice in history, in 1823 and in 2005, the last time, that indigenous people are animals per the papal bull of 1493, the Doctrine of Discovery. So because we have that so much in front of us, and the invasions of our territories and the theft and genocide, then we refuse to enjoy benefits as the proper members of the Black community. It's just it's just non-negotiable. So just wanted to mention that again, not telling anybody how they should identify, but there is a certain noble victimhood behind Blackness in America, and how it affects indigenous peoples who are deeply melanated, it tries to coalesce the marginalized interests against the awareness of tribal heritage of many so-called Black people who are indigenous and who have valid land claims that they have been disenfranchised from. So those land patents that Black people actually have as tribal people, those would be long-term goals, whereas being able to drink from a colonizer's water fountain as a Black person, having civil liberties, those are short-term goals. I'd rather not drink at the water fountain and have my land, and be able to tell the colonizer to leave back to wherever they came from. So that's the priority for me. I don't know about our audience, but Sleepy Turtle, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, for me, the big separation from the Black identity in my experience really began to happen after I resigned from my local indigenous group, for lack of a better term, without getting into politics, but because I felt that even though I was fully accepting of my Anyanguya and Nahagenset lineage, for some reason my specific African roots in Guinea weren't being respected somehow because of that Black identity with the rest of my quote unquote fellow Black people, my family to be specific. Now, when I do my own personal studies about the quote unquote Black movements or the Pan African movement, whatever you want to call it, I find that not only is the noble victimhood present for most of them, but there's all of these heavy, deep divisions, not just because of the Black connotation, but also because, of the present trauma histories and the mental and emotional illnesses that have been bred because of the Black label and its application, regardless of who it was applied to. Now, one thing to bring up specifically about Black Lives Matter, who I've never agreed with, from a social political standpoint, is when I speak to many of their supporters or their activists, I don't find too many of them to be as well articulate or well knowing about the complexities of the issues that we're all facing. I remember speaking to one
Mm-hmm.
mixed African woman who, for her at least, to respect that, proudly agrees to be called Black. And I had this conversation with her, with a few of her interns, through an independent bookstore for mostly leftist topics. And when I was presenting to her the legislation, like the Negro law of South Carolina or the Christian Black codes, or bringing up different indigenous struggles for the Black identity, she was heavily resisting and was getting somewhat rude and emotional because she just didn't want to hear it. Whereas her interns, who were all European, were openly listening and engaging me intellectually on that conversation. And this has happened several times where I find that I have more of a thought-provoking conversation socially with either non-indigenous people or Europeans. Now, indigenous people like you engage this with me like on an intellectual level, and therefore we're getting to the root of the problem for all of us. But it's just I couldn't comprehend in my life why the Europeans were more accepting of this information than the people that their forefathers applied all of these genocidal identities to. It was just the strangest conundrum that this has happened a
Trauma.
few times.
I would
Huh?
say trauma. I would say primarily trauma. And as the Garifuna were saying in that that article that I read from, they were being forced and threatened that they must adopt this. So I mean, I remember in school, the teachers, there was some, it was around the time of the Million Man March, the Farrakhan Million Man March in Washington D.C., and all there was well, I should say it was really it was really because of the mass incarceration of Black and Indigenous peoples that was happening as a result of the drug business that the CIA was pushing in melanated neighborhoods in the United States. And all of a sudden, there were so many people that were being psychologically tortured and physically tortured in the prison. And so um, then the Nation of Islam came around, and they were promoting uh, kind of a self-esteem kind of doctrine, that people should
Yeah.
be proud of their Africanness, and there was a lot of interest around the the Egyptian, like the black people are kings and queens, and everything. There was nothing about indigenous history. It was all about going back to Africa and Islam or whatever it was that was not.
Yeah.
And so at that time, my black they were promoting that, if I had any black in me, I should, or African, if I had any African descent whatsoever, then I should identify with Egypt, and the African. I mean, they would even, start to teach us that, like, the Egyptian religion of the pharaohs and all of that other stuff. So that's a I would say that's something that comes from psychological warfare more than anything else, because it's very weaponized. You're saying, well, these people that were they were the ones who were victimized, right? But once you remove people from the land that their family owns, like, for example, the reason why I never identified as black, because I'm land inheritor. And my father had, I was born 3 years after my father had received all the clan, signatures for his leadership of the land that was passed to him from my grandmother. So when I was born into land responsibilities, land inheritance, and my identity was with the land from birth. Whereas people who have been displaced, I would say the psychological manipulation that happens to them is much, I would say, much more profound, or it's much more permanent, because if you don't have land, it's kind of like a foundation, right? The land is, as an indigenous person, the land is your foundation. So if you believe that your land is in Africa, you're so far away from it, or if you don't even know that you have indigenous land ownership, then you're basically at the whim of anyone who says you're this or you're that. And if you try to identify as an indigenous person, there's a threat of death in the family. I mean, these are laws that still exist. They're being called archaic in the United States, but there are still laws. There are sundown towns still where if a person identifies as indigenous, they're subject to be killed, and they're just being toppled one after the other. There was one here in Boston, Massachusetts, a few years ago that said if an indigenous person goes into the center of Boston, then there's capital punishment for them. And so I would say, for people who are being told they don't own the land, all these lies, it's psychological warfare. That's all. But there was one situation, and I have to mention this again, going back to the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic, the Quisqueyan people, who are we are the head confederacy of the Taino peoples, the Cacicascos of Quisqueya. That's how we were, and we are the ones most now being called racist, even as the people next door have, of the country, also a colonizer country, because Dominican Republic is a colonial entity, and so is Haiti. A lot of people don't know that. These are colonial entities. These are not indigenous nations. But the country of Haiti actually has written into its constitution that the only way that a person can have land ownership is if they are black. Okay, so the blackness, as far as the colonial terminology, blackness in the colonial sense is part of the constitution of the country of Haiti. And because on the Dominican side, most of us are of indigenous descent, then we are called racist because we reject that foreign colonial identity. Meanwhile, the Haitian colonial state, they actually carried out, as part of the supposed independence, the slave independence movement that they had, they carried out ethnic cleansing of actual indigenous Kiskean Taino people. And as a result, today, most of their population, their quote unquote black population, actually has no indigenous ancestry whatsoever. Unlike the Garinago, who married into the indigenous family, the Haitians did not. So I was actually watching a TikTok the other day, and there was seemingly a black woman, seemed like she was a black. She spoke with an American accent, and she was talking about how that she went to some kind of academic mission in the Dominican Republic. She's from New York. She's living in New York, and they were at the border of between Haiti and Dominican Republic in an area that is called Dajabon. And she said that the Dominican border guards there mistook her for a Haitian. And this young lady, she was saying, oh, the Dominican border guards, they were mistaking me for Haitian because I'm black. But when I looked further into her account, it came out that she's actually Ghanaian. So she's calling herself African American, going to Dominican Republic. She has very clear, I could see that they had very clear Ghanaian features. Not talking about thick lips and nose. I'm talking about her eyes. They were, they're just a bit slanted, and they're wide set from the nose. And this is a very typical African tribal identity. And as Dominican people, Quisqueyan, who are mixed with indigenous and African, it is very clear for us that this person has no indigenous background. They have no indigenous ancestry. So for us in the tribal sensibility, this person is not indigenous. So that means that that person would belong on the Haitian side. See, so but she was trying to pass this off as a story about racial identity, and it's just ridiculous. So you go to Dominican Republic, walk among the people, and everyone is quote unquote black. Pretty much, like I don't know, maybe 10% of the country is lighter skin, like my skin and lighter, but the vast majority of people are very dark, and I'm only light skinned like this. And some of my siblings are much darker and like very very dark. But I'm like this only because of genetic, my mom being white and me being more like on the lighter skin. But I have siblings that are full blood to me that are darker. So and look more Dominican, by the way, perhaps. But yeah, for us, it has nothing to do with color. Never has been. It's about being able to identify very specific tribal phenotype, not so much ethnic phenotype, if that's clear. Does that help at all?
Well, as I keep telling my students, human beings are not crayons, because that entire situation with that one TikTok is her thinking that human beings are colors and not ethnicities, nationalities, or ancestries. Like, it's really simple, but yet for some reason, this mental illness, as I call it, color thinking, or the pigmentocracy, as it's really known as, it's a legal code
Yes.
system designed for nonsense like that. And yet, for those of us in the United States who think our color is our nation, our color is our race, and blah, 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 they don't understand basic civilization or the human diversity to begin with. But this is why, like, any of you can go on my Facebook and find post after post about me talking about this stuff. and yet the people who I'm directing it as people who are generally closer to my demographic, they resist it. That's why there's so few of them in my life. Because these color codes and systems don't exist among civilized people, because civilized people know that human
Mhm.
beings like have a vast amount of diversity by blood, not by your skin deep complexion, which falls under colonial law and the pigmentocracy, and even further than that, the
Right.
Christian black codes.
Right. Exactly. So the color, it's a way for people to have their family history erased, whether that has to do with their
Yeah.
resistance against slavery, like they got it, were never slaves, or even tracing their ancestral lineage to tribes anywhere in the world. And when we're talking about indigenous people, we're talking about the experience of people natural to the land, and that is, in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, but also in places like Australia and other places, in the world. I mean, there are phenotypically African East Indians, in the Indian subcontinent, and so when people's mentality is designed by the papal bull, the Vatican edicts, then it's mental illness. Just that's just what it is. It's not empowering. No matter what anybody says, it's not empowering. Um, I I don't feel to this day. I don't feel free to identify as a Black person, and I don't want to identify as Black because that's not true to my life history. And to my ancestors' history. That's just the fact. It has nothing to do with how I feel or how I felt growing up being discriminated against for being melanated. And believe you me, my parents were very, very resistant against the genocidal education that we were getting in the public schools, to the point where they took us out of there because of how racist it was. Even in the Black communities, the textbooks, my parents would say, look, these textbooks are written by the Vatican. They actually would say in the fine print, approved by the Vatican, the Catholic diocese of such and such. In the fine print at the beginning of the textbooks that we were reading in school, all the way to college. Okay, and one of the stark memories that I had that really impacted me as a child, and even as an adult today, I refer to it with, shivers go down my spine, because I was so innocent as a 10-year-old, 9-year-old. And I would come home with these very thick social studies books. And my parents, they were very involved in my homework. So they would ask me, what are you reading about? So I would tell them. And then one afternoon while I was doing my social studies homework, my parents said, press on the sides of the book. And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, press toward the center, where the binding, the pages go like kind of like that. So they were telling me to take my hand and press it down there. And I was like, what for? And so they said, look in between, in the crease. And sure enough, there were these small little huts. And my parents said, those are the slave houses. Okay, this is how my parents taught me. And they said, you see what happened? They're hiding from you the atrocities that they've done to the people by putting hiding the slave quarters in all these pictures of the southern, the southern belles and the plantations and all of that other stuff. They put the picture of the slave quarters. Mind you, I'm in a Black school. They put the picture of the slave quarters in the hidden crease of the book, so that the child, being Black, doesn't even know about how evil those white men were, and white women were, or are in many cases today, but they still have slave skin lamps and slave hair chairs. I saw a person restoring one of those chairs on TikTok again the other day. I mean, it was craziness. People are actually inheriting um, proudly their role as man-eating zombies. There's a lot of cannibalism that was involved as well. Eating black people, eating indigenous people. The Europeans did that as colonizers. They did that. So that has been hidden from the people. And my parents were um, extremely pointed to me not to idolize the white history of the United States. You know, the George Washington, the Thomas Jefferson, the Benjamin Franklin, all these individuals. They would show me that these were people that were intent on genocide. Even as our black teachers that were supposedly so proud to be black, so proud to be American citizens, U.S. American, of course, um, were completely ignoring, even as being black. So that's why, for me, blackness, it means erasure. And now that Sleeping Turtle is saying to me, that's actually the literal definition. It means erasure, which is, it's really mind blowing.
Well, that's
But at the
why.
time when my parents showed me those things, yeah, no, when my parents showed me those things, I was looking at them like they were, they were enemies, like public enemy number one, like, you know what I'm saying? Like almost as if they were indoctrinating me with some kind of like militant ideology. This is how I felt, because my teachers were, they had this little game, like a finger game. They supposedly, like you pray for the president, you pray for the church, you pray for the, like they were teaching us these mnemonic cues to idolize whiteness in a black school. You understand? So my parents were like, no, you don't play that game. You don't do the church steeple thing. Did you ever do that as a child?
No, no, never.
Yeah, church steeple, something like all the church steeple and all the people, something like this. Like we would do this game in school, and you have to make a, like this with your fingers, and that this would be the church, and then inside is all the people. I forget, it's like some kind of rhyme, but anyway, we're being indoctrinated with genocidal stuff about the residential schools and the church steeple, the fort of the genocidal empire, and all of that is what is black to me, because that's where I learned it, in the black schools. So that's why I can't identify it, because it means erasure. It means erasure of history more than anything else. But yeah, go ahead, Sleeping Turtle. I didn't mean to interject too much, but we were actually going to have another guest that was going to talk about the personal experiences, but because she wasn't able to make it, so I'm kind of filling in for her. So I'm kind of doing two roles instead of one for this interview. That's why I'm talking more than I usually. But go ahead, Sleeping Turtle.
Well, going back to what you said about black being erasure, why you think people use black markers to black out information on documents? Coincidence much? No.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I've had much of an uphill struggle with these, specifically a few different groups, because I have to mention a few different entities within the quote black diaspora, which is all distorted anyway. When I speak to Black Lives Matter activists, and they're so high and mighty about them trying to reclaim the identity as black and make it positive, and then I listen to a lot of things they say. Well, we have to, do black stuff. And I'm like, what is black stuff? Right? Or it's like, well, we have to make sure that our children know about black music. What do you mean black music? Most American popular music is from the African community. So that's one. But then the other thing is like, well, we have to make sure that we teach them black culture. Oh, you mean slave culture, right? So the more I keep picking their brain about it, I would say to them, all right, so yeah, you're born free, but you're still picking cotton in your mind. Yeah, and I know that sounds harsh, but whether
Yeah.
it's Black Lives Matter or the Black Panthers or the Nation of Islam or the whatever they want to call themselves this week in their different groupings, when they're presented with facts, whether if they're legal, linguistic, ethnographic, or historical, they think that their ancestry begins at 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation. But yet at the same time, which we'll get to, even though the Emancipation Proclamation was done, one, that was the government freeing the slaves. So that's emancipation. It wasn't the slavers freeing them, which would be manumission. So again, linguistics within law are
Well,
everything.
recently,
Now, after
recently, I recently heard that there's a project called the 1619 Project, and that's supposed to be noting the first Black slaves that were brought to America. And when I heard that, I was very offended by that, because the first slaves in the Americas uh, were indigenous people, and there were people that were stolen from the tribes here in Massachusetts as early as the late 1500s. And then, of course, from the Taino, beginning in 1492, there were members of us that were brought as black slaves, to North America for the colonies up here. In Massachusetts, one of them, her name being Tituba, she was taken from Barbados. An Arawakan woman actually started the Salem witch trials up here as a rebellion against her enslavers. So the enslavement of people called Black did not in any way begin in 1619. It began in 1492 in the Americas. In 1492, among the Taino, cinnamon black people. My people, as indigenous, are what would be called connotatively black. We are black. That's our natural color, is dark, with some reddish tint. That's how we naturally are. I'm not, my complexion is obviously not, original, but our people are very dark skinned, and we were taken slaves. So no way, 1619. Besides, southern Florida, also the Spanish were taking Africans there, because they already had the papal bull permission in 1452 and 55 to take Africans from Africa, as slaves. So how in the world is slavery going to begin in America in 1619? It boggles the mind. But like you said, erasure. That's the main focus of the elite colonial Black identity.
yes, and that's the thing, because when you look at the 1619 project or the whole Juneteenth craze, which is not a word, it's made up, it's not proper English in any way, which I'll get to. But the thing about 1619, the people who are doing that don't know history. Like, everything you just said is true, and for them to think that it was only, this one specific group of people at this date, which completely defies everything we know about the origin of European colonialism, it's ignorance. But they're doing that to fit their own specific narrative to push the Black agenda, which is really just African capitalism for these people who think they're Black, who don't know any better. Like you can find like merchandise that will say Black pride, Black power, Black excellence, Black beauty. The word Black is negative whether they want to accept it or not. Wait, I have to. I'm trying to calm down because
Mm-hmm.
trust me, I lose sleep over this sometimes. But then with Juneteenth, why is it that one they would make that a federal holiday where it's not a word, you really can't find it in a dictionary, but yet if they're celebrating the emancipation of the slaves, why is it not called Emancipation Day? If people don't know what emancipation means, they can look it up and then they're up to date with it. And that was something where like my summer classes this year were supposed to
Yeah.
start on Juneteenth, and I'm glad that they didn't.
Oh, well, uh, that's kind of a linguistic, a linguistic matter. I think um, it has to do with people who were not told that um, they were free, and there was at the time they were, when this during the slavery times, um, they had there was the slave owners were trying to prevent them from knowing that they were already free. So
Mm-hmm.
and that the way that they were able to remember, it was a simplified way, because you have to remember that people who were enslaved were not allowed to, you know, uh, learn. They weren't allowed to be literate. Um, they were prevented from actually learning. He also punished for even learning the alphabet by death often too. So by saying Juneteenth, that was a way for them to be easily pass on the information that they were actually legally emancipated. Um, so I'm looking at the Wikipedia page, but yeah, there's some kind of there are cultural references behind um, the emancipation thing. Uh, yeah, I'd have to. I mean, I don't. Again, I don't. I'm not telling. I'm not going to tell people how they should identify, but people should definitely become aware that people of African descent in the Americas, in particular, um, we have we have varied approaches to rights that um, that have been held back due to the papal bulls. Okay, this is the Vatican is the one that created the confusion. But as in Bolivia, there's an African king. You can look it up. The African king in Bolivia. There's an African king in Bolivia who is a legal part of the plurinational state of Bolivia today. Okay, we have the Garinago, who are never slaves and who do not want to be called African by any stretch of the imagination, because they're indigenous Arawakan people, although being of African descent. And there's just the majority of our African descent history does not come within the context of being a Black American of the United States. And the American thrust, has been to clear the land of indigenous people because of the land claims, because of the papal bull, again, 1493, doctrine of discovery, the manifest destiny of white people, okay, of colonizers to say there's no ethnic relationship to the land here. We're going to wipe all the genocide, everybody, and have no relationship to the land, okay? And most of indigenous people have been robbed of our identities in the United States because of that specific thrust. The genocides that happened in the 1990s among the Guatemalan, the Central Americans, the Mexican, indigenous peoples. This happened being pushed by the huge amount of funding that was coming through the slave industry in the United States. there was trillions and trillions of dollars being put toward creating a white Western Hemisphere. But outside of the United States, although in the United States today is like about 3 or 4%, registered indigenous descent. But outside of the United States, most people outside of the United States in the Americas are indigenous, are of indigenous descent. So, and most of the African descended people are there too. So, really, the only way to understand one's identity as an African descended person is really to go to each of these countries and learn and absorb and speak. Let our African descended peoples speak for ourselves. What is our history? That's the most important thing. What is our historical chronological experience? And then sharing that, then we can grow out of that noble victimhood and the psychological manipulation that is being used by those legislators who are trying to take advantage of our ignorance of their intent of the paper bull, their interpretation of the paper bull to call us homo animalis, or human animals. So this is just a reality, and it's not ancient history. This is from 2005, United States Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was recently outed as a flagrant racist after her death. The news media, the MSNBC, I think it was Katie Couric, I think, who interviewed her, if I'm not mistaken, and she actually got Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice, in her reporting notes, saying Black people just need to be grateful for what we white people gave them, or something to that effect. And she eliminated that from her report just so that she could make it seem that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a equality person. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a KKK member. That's the reality. And she's the same person that, for the second time in 2005 in the U.S. history, U.S. Supreme Court history, made reference to the Papal Bull of 1493, the doctrine of discovery, saying all indigenous people are animals and therefore they have no right to the land. Okay, so if that's the frame in which anybody claims an identity, whether it be indigenous, whether it be Black, whether it be Asian or white or anything, they should understand that they're actually taking part in the manifest destiny. They're taking part in erasure. They're taking part in genocide and colonialism, and they are a colonizer. So where do we conclude this conversation? A sleeping turtle.
All right.
The last note.
The last thing.
We were. Yes. Where do we conclude this conversation? I was just trying to figure out the other note.
Well, to make my point in relation to what you said about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who unfortunately a lot of the left propped her up as some like lost queen, which is their ignorance. But what I'm going to read, it's very short, but I'm going to read part of the Christian Black Codes. This is the draft from 1724. And many of them were instituted in the United States after the end of the American Civil War with the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, for those of you who don't know, Black laws or Black codes are specific weapons legally to limit or prohibit the rights of freed people, regardless of if they were indigenous or African or some other marginalized group. All right, so please hold your thoughts. I'm going to get right to them, so bear with me. Christian Black Codes of 1724, Article 1, decrees the expulsion of the Jews from the colony. Article 2, make it imperative on masters to impart religious instruction to their slaves. Article 3 permits the exercise of Roman Catholic creed only. Every other mode of worship is prohibited. Article 4, Negroes placed under the direction or supervision of any person other than a Catholic are liable to confiscation. Animals. Article 5, Sundays and holy days, holidays are to be strictly observed. All Negroes found at work on these days are to be confiscated. Article 6, the last one I'll read. We forbid our white subjects. White is a legal term for a subject in colonial law for you Europeans. Of both sexes to marry with, quote, the blacks under penalty of being fined and subjected to some other arbitrary punishment. We forbid all curates, priests, or missionaries of our secular and regular clergy, and even our chaplains and our navy to sanction such marriages. We forbid all of our white subjects and the even manumitted or freeborn blacks to live in a state of concubinage with slaves. Should there be any issue from this kind of intercourse, it is our will that the person so offending and the master of the slave should pay each a fine of 300 livres. Should said issue be the result of concubinage of the master, his slave, said master shall not only pay the fine, but be deprived of the slave and of the children, who shall be adjudged to the hospital of the locality, and said slave shall be forever incapable of being set free. But shall this illicit intercourse have existed between a free black and his slave, when said slave, according to the forms described by the church, said slave shall become free and legitimate, and in such case there shall be no application of the penalties mentioned in the present article. You see where all those problems come from,
Yeah,
with people
this
thinking
is
that
really,
they're black?
yeah, exactly. And
Go ahead.
children, indigenous children, like myself, have been we have been preyed upon by the colonizer state, through their churches, to their torture camps. And I was also intermittently such a victim, of those black codes. It says when you're mixed, you get taken, and they call these things foster care, child protective services. The original purpose of that, exactly what you read, it was to remove children from, and to terrorize us, abuse us, and psychologically mutilate us so that we could not be functioning within our human society. These are extremely grotesque laws that were put in place and acted upon by the colonizers, and they are still in effect, even though people are having supposed freedom being black today. So, for example, like the Dred Scott decision, where black people who are black or African descent have, they break away through some kind of interpretation of the U.S. Constitution from certain oppression, but that's when it's applied on the federal level. So black people cannot be discriminated against for employment, for example, because the employer has to report to the Internal Revenue Service. So they pay for their registration, as to operate within the country. But when it comes to the state institutions like Child Protective Services, they're still operating within the Christian Black codes. They're still seizing children of mixed heritage and abusing us. And you know, there's still residential schools. They reporting that the last residential school was closed in 1996, but that's not true. There are still residential schools in the Americas that seize children, and we're kept on farms and actually, you know, as slaves by white people. This is very prevalent in the Midwest, where there are a lot of ranches and, you know, need for manual labor. Indigenous children, I mean, from America, not just South and Central American, but actually, you know, children from the Dene tribe, the children Lakota tribe are seized by the state, the white governors, and they're handed out as farm hands to work for free on the white people's ranches, and where they're abused and all kinds of things. The slavery is still going on. There's not many things that have changed, and it's actually gotten worse because today there are more, because of the population obviously being greater, there are more children in the residential school now than there were at the time when they were housed in a single facility, and more in the so-called foster care industry, where we're used as guinea pigs for the pharmaceutical giants, and the foster care to prison pipeline, where we are then, by the U.S. Constitution, the 13th Amendment, convicted and designated as legal slaves. That's 13th Amendment, if you read it. Slavery was never abolished in the United States. It was just transmuted to something that only the federal government could, and the state governments could partake in. So with that, I'd like to invite, we did have time for another guest, so I just wanted to, let's see here.
One more quick thing.
Teresa wanted to join. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
All right, I'll make it quick. Now, I'm glad you brought up the Dred Scott case, and it's because of the Christian Black codes why he couldn't sue for his freedom, because he was still answering to those code words in the legislation. So the problem that the scholars have is that they say that the Supreme Court were being bigots. Well, they were, but they were still following the precedent set up by the Black codes. That if he agrees to be called those things, then he's not considered, then he can't sue for freedom. It was that simple for them. So not necessarily bigot court, more so plaintiff in error, because if he knew, then he would have had a different strategy.
Right, exactly. Well, with that, we're going to conclude today's installment of the series on race and ethnicity. We have already covered the indigenous identity in the colonial context by reviewing the term Indian in a previous video. Please check it in the list of videos on my profile. And then we are going to do another one on another colonial identity after this one in the upcoming weeks on whiteness and how this affects us as indigenous peoples in the world, and especially in the Americas today. Thanks all to our viewers who have commented. Thank you, Sleeping Turtle. And I wish everyone a restful and peaceful continuance to these explosions of our intellect. Seneko Kakona, abundant blessings. Ciao.